July 11th, 1302. The ground shakes. It's not an earthquake, it's hooves. Hundreds of heavy horses galloping in close formation, each carrying an ironclad knight. Lance couched, shield raised. The pride of the French nobility, moving like a wall of living steel. For any medieval army watching that mass approach, the normal response was simple: run. But this day was not going to be normal. Mounted heavy cavalry was the ultimate weapon of the Western Middle Ages. Nothing compared to the brutality of a cavalry charge against infantry in the open field. A warhorse weighing over 600 kilos at full gallop, carrying an armored knight that wasn't just a weapon. It was a death sentence. 200 knights charging in formation could shatter an entire infantry line in seconds, spreading terror before they even made contact. The sound of the hooves alone was enough to break resistance. By 1302, the French cavalry represented the absolute peak of centuries of military development. Knights trained from childhood, armor forged by Europe's finest blacksmiths, war horses bred for one purpose: war. Bigger, meaner, deadlier than anything a farmer or merchant had ever seen. And behind them, the entire financial machine of Western Europe's richest crown. There was a reason why the Western Middle Ages organized its social hierarchy around the mounted knight. It wasn't merely tradition. It was a direct consequence. The knight was invincible in the open field, and everyone knew it. Peasants and artisans knew it. Merchants knew it. Kings knew it. The medieval political order was, in part, a response to the fact that the man on horseback could kill anything put in front of him. So, in July 1302, about 8,000 to 10,000 Flemish artisans, weavers, leather tanners, carpenters, and blacksmiths from the guilds of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres stood their ground in a battle line on the outskirts of Courtrai, watching the French cavalry organize for the charge. And they did not run. Within a few hours, more than 700 French knights would be dead. What remained of Western Europe's most sophisticated army was in a chaotic retreat, and the Flemish artisans were collecting the golden spurs of the fallen nobles as trophies. How did this happen? The simplest answer is that it was the terrain. A stream and a network of drainage ditches turned into a trap. But that's not the whole story. The full story begins 2 years earlier, with a political decision that cornered an entire population, and ends with a lesson that the European cavalry refused to learn for the next century, and that refusal cost them dearly. Crécy, Agincourt. An entire generation of French nobility destroyed by lessons that began in a muddy field near Courtrai. But to understand why Flanders fought, you need to understand what Flanders was, and what had happened to it. Flanders, in the early 14th century, wasn't a peripheral region. It was one of the most sophisticated economic engines of Northern Europe. The cities of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres weren't simple medieval villages. They were industrial hubs of an impressive scale for their time, with populations larger than many European capitals, specializing in the production of high-quality cloth that supplied markets from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea. The business model was straightforward and highly lucrative. High-quality wool arrived from England through Flemish ports, was processed by weaver guilds using techniques perfected over generations, and went out as fine cloth sold at premium prices all across Europe. Flemish merchants had trade networks stretching across the entire continent. Flemish bankers lent money to kings. It was, in modern terms, a top-tier financial and industrial powerhouse, and this powerhouse had been, since 1300, under French occupation. The story of how Flanders ended up under the control of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, is a tale of dynastic maneuvering and mounting political pressure. The county of Flanders was technically a vassal fiefdom of the French crown, which gave the French kings legal grounds to interfere in its internal affairs whenever it suited them. In 1300, after a period of political instability in the county, Philip seized the opportunity and formalized its direct annexation, installing Jacques de Châtillon as governor. Châtillon wasn't great at managing angry locals. He was a French nobleman who saw Flanders as one thing: a cash cow. He raised taxes on trade. He slashed guild autonomy. The merchant elites who'd built Bruges and Ghent watched their power get stripped away piece by piece. The resentment was real and growing. But resentment without a trigger rarely turns into a rebellion. That trigger came on the night of May 17th to 1302. Historians call it the Bruges Matin, a reference to early morning prayers, because that's when the violence erupted. Flemish citizens of Bruges rose up against the French garrison occupying the city. What followed was methodical and brutal. The Flemish used a phrase in their native tongue, "Schild und vriend," meaning shield and friend, as a linguistic test. Pronouncing it correctly required a native speaker of the Flemish dialect. Anyone who stumbled over the words gave away their French or Francophone origins. That night, hundreds of French soldiers and officials were identified and killed within the city. The garrison representing the power of Philip IV in Bruges was, for the most part, wiped out. Jacques de Châtillon managed to escape, but the message had been sent in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Now think about what that meant politically. Slaughtering a medieval king's garrison wasn't a decision you could just take back. It was a declaration of war, and the Flemish knew that when they did it. This wasn't a spontaneous riot that spiraled out of control. It was a coordinated strike, executed at dawn in multiple parts of the city all at once. Someone had planned this. This changed the survival calculus entirely. Before the Matins, there was a theoretical chance for negotiation, for some political arrangement that could ease the tension without an all-out war. After the Matins, that possibility vanished. Philip IV couldn't just let the execution of hundreds of his soldiers slide. That would be an open invitation for every vassal of the crown to test the limits of what was tolerable. The response had to be military. It had to be fast, and it had to be overwhelming enough to serve as a permanent example. And the Flemish leaders knew this. They knew a French army was coming. They knew this army would be made up of the most formidable cavalry in Europe. They knew that, according to the conventional military logic of the 14th century, a militia of craftsmen stood absolutely no chance. Here's the question you ask when you're outnumbered and outmatched. How do you change the rules? How do you stop fighting their battle and start fighting yours? But before we talk about the rules, we need to look closer at these craftsmen, because understanding them is fundamental to understanding why what happened at Courtrai was even possible. The force that gathered in Flanders after the Bruges Matins was, on the surface, exactly what the French expected: a guild militia. Men who spent their days in workshops and studios, not on military training grounds. Weavers who knew the rhythm of the loom better than the rhythm of a cavalry charge. Tanners who understood leather, not steel. Carpenters who built houses, not defensive positions. By any medieval general's logic, this force should have been easy to write off. Decades of night training versus some basic militia instruction. The outcome was supposed to be obvious. And then there was the issue of equipment. French medieval knights wore high-quality steel plate armor, visored helmets, swords forged by master blacksmiths, and heavy lances. They rode expensive, highly trained war horses. The investment required to equip a single knight was equivalent to what would feed an entire village for years. The Flemish came with whatever they had. Simple helmets, if they were lucky. Chainmail for the best equipped among them, but no metal at all for many. No horses, no cavalry lances. None of the gear that made a medieval knight what he was. But there were a few variables the French had underestimated. The first was sheer size. The Flemish force gathered near Courtrai numbered between 8,000 and 10,000 men, a massive figure by any medieval standard. Guilds from prosperous cities could mobilize their members in huge numbers. The three great Flemish cities, Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, each sent their own militia contributions. And even lacking individual sophistication, a mass of 8,000 disciplined men holding the right position is a very different problem than a mass of 8,000 men in a panic. The second was collective discipline. Medieval guilds had strict hierarchies, rules, and consequences. That wasn't battlefield training, but it meant something. These men were used to following orders, coordinating with peers, and keeping it together under pressure. It wasn't military discipline, but the French underestimated how much it mattered. The third variable was the most interesting: the weapon they carried. The Godendag. Sounds friendly, right? It means good day, dark irony, considering what this thing did. Heavy wooden club, 5 to 6 feet long, with an iron-reinforced spike on top. Part club, part spear. Designed to kill you, whether you knew how to fight or not. What makes the Godendag so revealing is the kind of adversary it was designed to face. It wasn't built for infantry combat. It wasn't a cavalry weapon. It was specifically a weapon meant to deal with knights who were on the ground. The spike could penetrate the cracks between armor plates, finding the vulnerable spots that a sword strike would try to reach, but with the added advantage of not requiring the pinpoint precision of a blade. The heavy mass of the club could disorient and knock down a man covered in over 60 pounds of iron, even without penetrating the armor. The blunt force impact alone was enough. Think about what that implies. The Flemish, by equipping their militia with Godendags as their primary weapon, were making an implicit bet. The French knights would, at some point during this battle, be off their horses, on the ground, where the advantage of their mounts and the momentum of their charge no longer existed. This gamble relied on a plan to knock the knights out of their saddles before the melee even began. And that plan lay in the terrain itself, in a detail of the Flemish landscape that any local would know, but any invader would completely overlook. 2 Flemish nobles commanded the force, Guy of Namur and William of Jülich. They understood conventional warfare. And what they did next, how they positioned their army, revealed something brilliant: how to turn the ground itself into your weapon. The outskirts of Courtrai in the Flanders region had a very specific geographical feature that any native Fleming would recognize immediately, but that an outside invader could easily underestimate. It was drained land. Flanders is, geologically speaking, a low-lying coastal plain formed by river sediments, exactly the kind of terrain that, without constant management, would become waterlogged and uninhabitable. Centuries of agriculture had produced a practical solution: a dense network of drainage ditches dug by the farmers themselves to control the water level of the fields and make the land arable. These ditches weren't dramatic obstacles. They weren't castle moats, nor were they impassable rivers. They were purely functional agricultural structures, relatively discreet, often partially hidden by the vegetation along the edges of the fields, designed to manage water, not to intimidate. From the field, just a few yards away, many of them were virtually invisible until you were right on top of them. But for a galloping horse, they were an absolute catastrophe. Guy of Namur and William of Jülich positioned their force with the Groninger Beek, a drainage stream, covering a significant portion of their front, and the Grote Beek protecting one of their flanks. Between these two bodies of water, cutting right across the approach corridors the French cavalry would have to use to advance, lay the network of drainage ditches that made up the local agricultural landscape. From the French perspective, the Flemish position looked like a relatively open field. The distance between the two armies was great enough that the details of the intervening terrain were invisible to anyone not actively scanning the ground. And medieval knights about to charge were looking dead ahead at the enemy, not at the dirt beneath their horses' hooves. The Flemish didn't hide their positions. They stood in visible formation, in clear lines, looking exactly like what the French expected, an infantry militia waiting to be swept away by cavalry. But while the French saw a row of targets, the Flemish knew exactly what lay between them and the knights. Here's the thing that changed everything. Visibility. The ditches were invisible from a distance. Just vegetation, farmland, nothing that screamed danger. From the French perspective, just an open field between them and the Flemish. The French didn't scout properly. Maybe they thought tradesmen didn't deserve careful reconnaissance. Maybe they were in a hurry. Or maybe they just couldn't imagine that an open field could be a trap. Their mindset wouldn't allow it. Medieval military intelligence was, by and large, rudimentary. There were no detailed maps of the local terrain. There was no systematic tradition of sending out pathfinders to check the ground of specific battlefields. A medieval general evaluated the battlefield primarily based on what he could see from his vantage point, and from that position. The field between the two forces looked perfectly suited for cavalry. That single misjudgment would cost the lives of many of France's finest knights. There was also the doctrinal dimension of the Flemish position. The commanders enforced a rule that went against the most basic survival instinct on a battlefield. No one pursues, no one flees, no one breaks formation. The line holds. When the cavalry inevitably got stuck, the advance would be controlled and coordinated, not an avalanche of individuals rushing into a melee. For a trained warrior, that kind of discipline is incredibly hard to maintain. For a tradesman who had never been in a real battle, with a wall of galloping cavalry bearing down on them, holding that line was an astounding feat of collective courage, but the Flemish held it. The morning of July 11, 1302, began with the Flemish in position, standing, probably praying. Contemporary accounts mentioned collective prayers before the battle, which was not uncommon for the time, but in this specific context carried a particular weight, because those men knew they could be praying for the last time. They stood still in their ranks, waiting. The entire philosophy of the Flemish plan depended on not attacking first, on forcing the French to come to them, toward the prepared ground. On the French side, Robert II of Artois organized his force. Robert was a veteran nobleman, nephew of Philip IV, with a respectable military reputation and clear political reasons for wanting a quick and decisive victory. Among them were some of the most important nobles in France: counts, barons, feudal lords, each bringing their retinue of armed knights and their own precedents of how battles should be won. The French force included more than cavalry. Robert had infantry and Genoese crossbowmen, the most sought-after hired shooters in medieval Europe. Crossbow specialists who could cause significant damage before the melee began. The standard doctrine for such an attack was functional. The infantry and crossbowmen advance first, create disorder in the enemy lines with projectile fire, weaken the cohesion of the opposing formation, and when the moment comes, when the enemy line is sufficiently disrupted, the cavalry makes the decisive charge and resolves the battle. It was a plan that had worked countless times. It was 14th century military orthodoxy in action. Robert ordered the initial advance. The infantry and Genoese crossbowmen advanced toward the Flemish lines and opened fire. The Genoese were efficient. Their crossbows had the range and penetration to cause casualties, even in disciplined formations. The Flemish responded. They had their own crossbows and projectiles, but their main response was simply to endure. They stood still. They absorbed the fire. They held their formation. Men fell, but the line held. It was at this moment that it became clear that this militia of craftsmen was not what the French expected, a demoralized army waiting for an excuse to flee. It was a force that had decided to die in place rather than break. And then the event happened that historians debate to this day. The French infantry and crossbowmen were called back. Before completing the job of wearing down the Flemish to the point where a charge would be relatively safe, they retreated. The question of why this happened has no definitive answer. Contemporary accounts are contradictory or vague, but there are three explanations that most historians consider plausible. The first is impatience. The knights saw craftsmen and refused to wait any longer. The chivalric code said, charge, direct, face to face. That was honor. Waiting for peasants to soften them up, that felt insulting, and medieval knights were notoriously hard to control once the moment seemed right. Plenty of battles were lost because cavalry just charged. The second explanation is tactical and logistical. The retreating infantry may have crossed paths with the cavalry that was positioning itself to advance, creating confusion at the critical moment. The army tripped over itself. The third possibility is that Robert made a deliberate decision, perhaps believing the Flemish were sufficiently shaken, perhaps calculating that the timing was right, perhaps pressured by knights who didn't want to wait any longer. Whatever the explanation and reality probably combined elements of all three, the result was the same. The infantry retreated. The field ahead of the Flemish was left open, and the French cavalry began to move, first a trot, organizing the formation, then a gallop. The ranks of heavy cavalry accelerated toward the Flemish lines. Lances at the ready, the thunder of hooves growing to a level that made the ground shake. On the Flemish side, the front ranks lowered their stances, Godendags pointed and waited. What happened in the next few minutes was the collapse of a military paradigm. The first knights reached the ditches. Imagine the physics of that moment. A galloping warhorse weighs over 600 kilos. With a rider and full armor, the whole package exceeds 750 kilos. This package is moving at a considerable speed, 18 kilometers per hour in a charging gallop. The momentum is enormous. Now imagine this package encountering a drainage ditch hidden in the roadside vegetation. A ditch that could be half a meter deep or a meter, with a muddy and unstable bottom. The horse doesn't see the ditch until it's right on top of it. By the time it realizes, it's too late to swerve or break the colossal inertia coming from behind. The horse falls, or it sinks its front legs into the mud and tumbles forward, or it tries to jump and fails to reach the opposite bank, falling in the middle. The rider on top, with 20 to 30 kilos of armor, is thrown. In muddy terrain, with the weight of the armor and the unstable ground, getting up is not trivial. Behind that first knight, hundreds of others were coming in close formation. The knights in the back couldn't see what had happened to those in the front. They were galloping in close formation, their vision limited by their helmet visors and their focus on the charge. They kept advancing, reached the exact same spot, and encountered the exact same problem. They fell, or they stopped abruptly, causing the knights behind them to crash into them. The cavalry formation, the whole point of which was momentum and cohesion, fell apart. Instead of a wall of steel, there was chaos. Fallen horses, knights stuck in mud, animals thrashing, knights in the back trying to stop or swerve, only to crash into the ones already down. The pressure from behind pushed the leading knights deeper into the mud. Those who stopped got crushed against the fallen ones. The formation piled up, compressed, and lost everything that made a cavalry charge deadly. That's when the Flemish moved, with their Godendags. A dismounted knight, clad in heavy armor, struggling to stand up in muddy terrain, is no longer the apex of the battlefield. He is a target. The armor that had been his shield and his identity became a metal prison that restricted his every move. Getting up required help or considerable effort. Running was impossible. Maneuvering was difficult. The Flemish had designed the Godendag for this exact moment. The spike sought out the gaps between the plates, neck, armpit, groin, visor, the points where the metal didn't cover or covered less thoroughly. The heavy mass of the club could knock down or disorient an ironclad man even without penetrating the armor. And with knights stuck in the mud, completely immobile, the work of the Flemish artisans was systematic. What ensued on the battlefield of Courtrai was no longer a cavalry battle. It was a hunt. The French had an additional complicating factor that, under normal circumstances, would have been an advantage. Captured knights were worth fortunes in ransoms. The medieval economy of war was built partly on this practice, capturing, not killing, the noble adversary, and then negotiating. It was a system that protected the lives of nobles even in defeat. The Flemish were not playing that game. They were not nobles who expected to be captured in turn and later ransomed. They were artisans in an existential conflict, fighting against the force that had occupied their cities and would come to massacre them if they lost. Capturing knights for ransom wasn't in their calculations. What was in their calculations was surviving the day and sending a message that could never be misinterpreted. They killed the fallen knights, systematically. Robert of Artois, seeing the situation deteriorating rapidly, tried to act. The accounts of the battle, fragmentary as they are, suggest that he sought to stabilize some sector, possibly with an action on the French right flank, where the terrain was slightly less problematic. There was fighting in that area. French knights reached the Flemish lines from that angle and caused some casualties. For a few moments, that flank had a different outcome than the center, but it wasn't enough to change what was happening on the rest of the field. And then Robert fell. The details of how he died vary depending on the source. He might have fallen from his horse into one of the holes. He might have been surrounded when his retinue was wiped out around him. He might have entered a close-quarters combat zone and never made it out. What the records agree on is that Robert II of Artois died on the battlefield that day, at some point during the collapse of the French charge. The death of a commander on a medieval battlefield had a disproportionately large impact. Medieval armies lacked efficient communication systems. Order in battle relied heavily on visible leadership, on a commander who could be seen and heard by the troops. When Robert fell, there was no second in command with enough authority to reorganize an army already in tactical collapse. What had been a tactical difficulty turned into a rout. The French knights who managed to get off the field fled. The Flemish, following their doctrine of avoiding uncontrolled pursuit, did not scatter into a wild chase. They maintained enough cohesion to consolidate the battlefield. They advanced, but in a way that preserved their formation. As the sun began to set on July 11, 1302, the field near Courtrai was covered in French dead. The Battle of Courtrai was over. The artisan militia had destroyed the French cavalry. What happened after the battle carried a symbolic weight that lasted for centuries. The Flemish roamed the field, conducting what could be described as an inventory of the dead. Specifically, they collected the golden spurs that adorned the boots of the fallen knights. To understand what the Flemish were really doing, understand what the spur meant. It wasn't decoration. It was the symbol of chivalric identity given in ceremony. Proof you'd earned the right to call yourself a knight. You didn't buy this. You earned it. It was a lifetime of training, a membership card to the warrior class that ran medieval society. More than 700 spurs were collected from the battlefield, 701 according to some accounts, each spur corresponding to a fallen knight. The number was devastating by any measure of the era. Losing 700 knights in a single day of battle meant wiping out an entire generation of French military nobility. The spurs were hung in the Church of Our Lady in Courtrai. It was a public, permanent statement that everyone could see. This is what we did. This is what we took from them. The battle became known for exactly that. The Battle of the Golden Spurs. The immediate political impact was significant. Flanders had freed itself from French occupation militarily, and the cost France had paid was far too high for an immediate military response. Reorganizing a cavalry force after losing 700 knights in one day required time, resources, and perhaps most difficult of all, the willingness of the surviving nobles to once again face that specific enemy on that specific terrain. But it would be a mistake to conclude that Courtrai guaranteed Flemish independence once and for all. The real story is more complicated, and it's worth telling honestly. Philip IV was a pragmatic and persistent king. He didn't abandon Flanders. He continued to apply diplomatic and economic pressure, and when the opportunity arose, military pressure as well. The Flanders that had won at Courtrai was in a structurally weak position compared to France, smaller demographically, politically fragmented among guild factions, and economically dependent on markets that the French crown could influence. In 1305, the Treaty of Athis-sur-Orge was signed, and its conditions revealed the reality of their relative power. The Flemish agreed to pay heavy indemnities, demolish certain fortifications, cede border areas, and accept limitations on their future military capacity. It was a considerable diplomatic defeat for those who had won militarily just 3 years prior. The treaty showed that winning a battle, even so completely and spectacularly, was not the same as winning the war. Flanders remained within an orbit of French pressure for decades. In 1328, at the Battle of Cassel, French forces defeated the Flemish and regained some of the lost political ground. And according to some sources, the spurs that had been hung as trophies in the Church of Our Lady were taken down by the victorious French, the symbol of the 1302 humiliation reversed by the symbol of the 1328 recovery. The victory at Cassel was real, but it didn't erase the fundamental fact. Flanders had remained essentially autonomous for decades thanks to what was achieved at Courtrai. The political impact of 1302 was real and lasting, even if not permanent. The city of Bruges continued to flourish. The guilds continued operating with significant degrees of autonomy. The total occupation that Philip IV had tried to impose in 1300 was never fully restored. But what could not be reversed, neither by Cassel nor by any subsequent French victory, was the military demonstration that Courtrai had delivered. Because some lessons, once written in blood on a battlefield, cannot be unlearned, even if everyone would rather ignore them. For centuries, European military theory operated on one principle: cavalry was supreme. Infantry was support. That wasn't opinion. It was empirical observation built from generations of battles. Cavalry beat infantry in the open field. Period. Courtrai introduced a clause that had been ignored. In the open field was a variable, not a constant. On terrain controlled and specifically chosen by the defender to neutralize the attacker's main advantage, disciplined infantry with the right weapon could destroy cavalry. Completely. They didn't need to be faster. They didn't need to be heavier. They needed to be smarter about where to fight and about how to turn the terrain into an extension of their own strategy. And this lessened that terrain, and not just brute force, could be the most decisive weapon appeared repeatedly in the following decades. 12 years after Courtrai, in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce of Scotland used similar logic. The heavy cavalry of Edward II of England charged toward the Scottish position on terrain that Bruce had deliberately chosen, riddled with bogs and hidden pits that disoriented the English cavalry formation. The result was a British defeat just as complete as the French one at Courtrai. 32 years after Bannockburn in 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, the English longbow demonstrated a variation of the same principle. Instead of using the terrain to physically stop the cavalry, English archers used projectiles to halt the cavalry before it reached their lines, inflicting such heavy casualties during the approach that the charge never made effective contact. A different technique, but an identical principle. Neutralize the cavalry's momentum before it could unleash its strength. And in 1415, Agincourt repeated the lesson with even greater emphasis, with the French cavalry destroyed once again, this time by a combination of muddy terrain and English archers. Almost a century after Courtrai, the French cavalry was still making the same mistakes. What military historians call a revolution in medieval warfare was emerging throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries. A gradual shift in the theory and practice of combat that rebalanced the power between cavalry and infantry. The change was slow and uneven. There were setbacks. Cavalry continued to dominate in many battles, but the trajectory was clear. Why didn't the cavalry learn faster? That is perhaps the most fascinating question that Courtrai raises. Part of the answer is cultural. The medieval knight wasn't just a soldier, it was a social class. Being a knight was a title, an identity, a worldview structured around specific values: honor, loyalty, direct confrontation, prowess in individual combat. The cavalry charge wasn't just a tactic, it was an expression of who you were within the hierarchical order of medieval society. Asking a medieval knight to fight on foot, to let commoners do the heavy lifting, you weren't just asking him to change tactics, you were asking him to stop being who he was, to abandon everything his identity was built on. Part of it was economic and political. The nobility built their power on one premise: chivalric superiority. If a weaver with a club could kill a trained knight, what did that say about the system? What did it say about the entire social order that depended on the nobility's military dominance? And part of the answer is simply that Courtrai, Bannockburn, Crécy, and Agincourt were repeatedly framed as exceptions. Special conditions, specific terrain, mistakes by a particular commander, coordination errors that would not be repeated, not as a universal lesson about the limitations of cavalry, but as anomalies that proved the rule, because the rule was comfortable for those at the top. Modern military scholars call this doctrinal rigidity. It's what happens when victorious armies keep using yesterday's tactics, even when the world's changed. It's not stupidity, it's institutional loyalty to an identity that worked. Until it didn't. Military history is full of versions of this exact same mistake. Armies that kept using techniques that had worked in the previous war, even when the next war had changed the fundamental conditions. The resistance to learning isn't an exclusive trait of medieval knights. But going back to Courtrai, and to what the Flemish did, there is a principle that transcends the 14th century. What Guy of Namur and William of Jülich did by positioning their forces between the Groninger Beck and the drainage ditches of Courtrai was not a makeshift solution by desperate people out of options. It was a calculated strategic decision, perhaps the most important of the entire battle, made days before the first projectile was fired. Here's what they saw. The French cavalry's power depended on one thing: open, flat terrain. Replace that with a field full of hidden obstacles they can't gallop across, and their entire advantage evaporates. They didn't try to be stronger than the knights. They didn't try to train their craftsmen to fight one-on-one with professional knights. They tried to put the knights in a situation where all their strength, the horse, the armor, the momentum of the gallop, the training was worthless. The terrain wasn't an accidental advantage the Flemish stumbled upon. It was a tool they chose, understood, and deliberately utilized. It was engineering applied to the battlefield, the very agricultural landscape of the land transformed into a weapon. 700 golden spurs torn from dead French nobles. A militia of weavers and craftsmen that destroyed the most feared army in Western Europe. A drainage ditch that became a turning point in military theory for a century. The ditch wasn't the weapon. It was the consequence of asking a question the French never did. Where do I want to fight? And that question, not armor, not numbers, but terrain and conditions, is the most decisive question any strategist can ask. Every battle's decided before the first strike. It's decided when you choose the ground. If this kind of story battles that seem impossible until you understand the hidden logic beneath them is what you came here for, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next story uses the same principle in a way that will surprise you even more. How an army with no money, no horses, and no allies used a single idea to shift the balance of power in an entire region. The terrain changes. The principle does not.